Hello everyone, it's Andy Wilson with you for the Traveller in the Evening, our latest podcast. Tonight we're going to be talking about William Blake, Castoriadis and the Social Imaginary. Explain the title before we start, why it's possibly of interest, so to say. My special guest tonight is an old friend of mine, Joe Ruffle. Joe is currently researching his PhD in aspects of communism in Romania, which is a fascinating topic, and maybe we'll get him back on the podcast at some point to talk about it. But before I bring Joe in, I first of all want to sort of set the scene and say something about why I thought the topic is, well, it's certainly of interest to me. I hope it's of interest to you, but why it's of interest to me. And that's to do with how I've engaged with William Blake. I started studying Blake some years ago and I dived more deeply into him. And I found that I was becoming essentially a Blake. I was beginning to see the world from what I understood to be Blake's point of view. And a key attraction of Blake for me is the radicalism of his thought, the radicalism of his politics and so on. But in terms of his ideas generally, a key notion of his is about the imagination. And in a funny sense, and I don't mean this in any sort of precise way, but in a sense, the imagination fills a space in Blake's thought, which would have been filled by politics in other people's thoughts. He talks about the imagination and the exercise of the imagination as the essential part of the work of building Golgonooza, or the New Jerusalem. So his alter ego within his mythology, Los, exercises imagination in building Golgonooza, as I say, the New Jerusalem, his new republic. And so the imagination is absolutely vital to Blake. But at the same time, if you think about, there's a lot of Blakeans, a lot of people interested in the work of Blake. Of course, they understand the centrality of the imagination in Blake. But it's generally received as just Blake being positive and upbeat about imaginative work, being an artist, and the importance of that to a national culture. Now, of course, that is part of what Blake's saying. But Blake's idea of the imagination goes way, way beyond that kind of very loose sense. At points, Blake talks about the imagination being the body of Christ, being itself the divine, the body of the divine. And it's such a radical thought that I used to sit and think, well, what does Blake really mean by that? And it took me ages to realise that he means completely literally, imagination is the body of Christ. And you might say to yourself, well, so what really? What's the importance of the divine from that point of view? Well, if you look at it from the point of view of mind, the imagination is the primum mobile, the unmoved mover. It's what determines the things within thought, so to say, but is itself undetermined. So that's why later on we're going to be talking about the importance of the idea that when Blake and Castoriadis talk about the imagination, they're talking about a very radical sense of the imagination in which it generates its results ex nihilo. And this is a fantastically important distinction, and it's a distinction made in a debate between Coleridge and Wordsworth, where Wordsworth spoke of the imagination as the human power to reorganize its ideas in novel ways. So in other words, he thought the imagination always took its content from experience and then reworked it according to reason or whatever. Whereas Coleridge had a much more radical idea of the imagination as, again, imagination ex nihilo. It could create something entirely new. So what I've been trying to say is that Blake's idea of the imagination is central to its politics. But what does that mean exactly? And so it's with that in mind that I was really interested when I read about the work of the post-Marxist we'll talk about his history as a Marxist in a moment, but the post-Marxist thinker, philosopher, psychologist, psychoanalyst, whatever, Cornelius Castoriadis. I suppose I should throw the ball over to Joe at around this point, because what I want to say is that Castoriadis talks about this idea of the social imaginary, and he too puts the imagination at the centre of his thoughts, but in a completely different way to Blake, or rather coming at the problem from a completely different point of view to Blake as a Marxist, post-Marxist, originally materialist and whatever. He's not coming from anything like Blake's Christian background. But they both arrive at this idea of the centrality of the imagination. And that is what really caught my attention. And I suppose in a really crude way, I was thinking, well, maybe there's something in Castoriadis which not exactly patches up a hole in Blake, but throws light on what Blake's power of the imagination might have meant politically. So with all that having been said, I'd now like to throw the discussion over to Joe. And perhaps, Joe, you could start by telling us just a little bit about Castoriadis' background, because it's a fascinating background in the kind of libertarian Marxism of the 50s and then the 60s, which you and I have some background ourselves. So, yeah, where was Castoriadis coming from, Joe?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, Andy. Hopefully we'll have an interesting discussion. So, I mean, Castoriadis is obviously Greek, joined the Communist Party as in his teens in Athens, and by the time he was about 19, he broke with Stalinism and joined the local Trotskyist organization. This was in the early 40s and tumultuous period in Greek history, part of the Axis occupation of Greece. It was that period of time. And the Trotskyist organisation had a revolutionary defeatist position, which is quite extraordinary. You think that they'd been occupied by the Germans. But Agustinus was the main figure, the animating figure of that organisation, who was a bit of a legendary figure on the Greek left, as far as I understand, a bit of a kind of martyr type figure who Castoriadis later says gave his prison rations away to others, and was quite emaciated and spent quite a lot of his the years after this, after Castoriadis had already left Greece for France in prison, etc. So as I've noted, Castoriadis left France after a period of time, I think in 1944, 1945, and joined the Trotskyist organisation there, the wing of the Fourth International, the branch, I should say, of the Fourth International in France, and hooked up with a Trotskyist activist that would later be quite a famous political philosopher, Claude Lefort. And they developed a tendency within the organisation, had a kind of state capitalist understanding and circulated papers on this basis, and tried to win the organisation to a kind of more radical anti-Stalinism based on the idea that the Soviet Union was capitalist rather than deformed, that Trotsky thought. And after that didn't work out, inevitably as it did, that they founded the Socialism or Barbarism organisation that existed from 1949 to 1966, although Lefort kind of dropped out of that in the 50s, and Castoriadis was the main animating figure of that throughout. Some quite famous members, Jean Laplanche, the famous psychoanalyst, Guy Debord for a while, and some other famous people. And so basically, over a period of time, they developed a kind of quite libertarian socialism, semi-critical of orthodox Marxism, and over time that developed into a kind of critique of Marxism as well. During this period, quite amusingly, Castoriadis worked as OECD as an economist, and apparently spent his days doing his work in the morning and then writing for the Socialism or Barbarism journal in the afternoon on company time, which is always quite amusing. Apparently in the OECD offices now, they have some kind of plaque up to him saying he worked here, but quite amusing. I guess his management didn't know he was doing that at the time. And obviously management and the idea of bureaucracy is really important for Castoriadis. He sees this as an element that Marx couldn't prefigure, and quite an important that. And that relates to one of the main themes of his work, which is the idea of mastery, rational mastery, the idea of kind of basically managing kind of resources, managing nature. And of course, in the workers' movement, what he saw as managing, the activity, the self-activity of the working class, which is later critique of Marxism. And his work on the imagination is deeply involved in the idea that Marxism became a kind of bastardized theory of the workers' movement, which grew out of kind of imaginative radicalism of the working class, but then became essentially trapped in Marx's theory of history, which basically determined it. Yeah, is that okay to start with?
A couple of thoughts occurred to me. One is sort of for the benefit of our listeners, a bit of context here. So, Joe's been talking about the trajectory of French Trotskyism, presenting a state capitalist analysis, meaning an analysis of Russia as being essentially driven by capital accumulation rather than anything else. And all of those stories are part of a wider story of the eventual rebirth of the left in the 60s. And I'm jumping ahead slightly, obviously, here, but it's a multi-decade process leading to the 60s, if you know what I mean. So in the 50s, you have the growth of a number of libertarian Marxist groups. And some of them are coming from within Trotskyism and, in a sense, breaking to the left of it. And if you look at that story in Britain, then the group that did that here were I think what were they called originally, Joe? They became the International Socialists and then became the Socialist Workers' Party, the SWP today. It started off as the Socialist Review Group. That's it. But the point is that in developing a state capitalist analysis of Russia as capitalist, they're sort of breaking with Trotskyism to the left. And it sounds to me as though, well, I know that the Socialism or Barbarism group that Castoriadis was involved in were doing something very similar. So, if you look at an SWP member today, it's a bit like sort of, evolutionary scientists in the 19th century having to prove that men and monkeys are related. But in political evolution, it's the other way around. The WP is the monkey. And their predecessors back in the late 50s, the Socialist Review Group and International Socialists, were actually really interesting people. As I say, breaking with Trotskyism to the left, but developing ideas like state capitalism. And I wanted to say that because that gives context to the kind of overlap of these ideas and where you and I were coming from, Joe. Sorry, to the listeners, both Joe and I were involved in the Socialist Workers' Party for a while. So it kind of has that kind of interest for us, how this French group were developing ideas in parallel to the group that became the SWP. And in fact, I am told that very early on in the history of the journal, International Socialism, Journal of the IS, they actually had British representatives of the Socialism or Barbarism group on the editorial board. I think actually it's Chris Pallis, isn't it? But Pallis, who you'll know, Joe, from Solidarity, and Ken Weller as well, who was a worker militant in the group Solidarity, a British group. And they were, well, you described them, Joe. They individually came from a Trotskyist background. I know that Ken Weller had been in the WRP. We don't want to get into too much sectarian history here, but from my point of view, the interesting thing is that the early International Socialists had some overlap with the Socialism or Barbarism group Castoriadis was involved in. Is that about the state of it, Joe? Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah. I think there's a couple of additional things there that might be of interest. One is that state capitalism has a long history as a term, and it means a number of different things in a number of different contexts. It was used in the 1920s to talk about the Soviet government's policy, essentially, of building up the state apparatus as a kind of semi-positive but a kind of defensive measure when European revolutions didn't pan out the way they thought. Then there was a state capitalist critique in the camps where militant people from the Democratic Centralist group in the Bolshevik Party as well were close to that kind of analysis, and others. The Russian Enigma, Siliga's famous book, talks about this to some degree. And then obviously, yeah, you have a number of different kind of state capitalisms later. One, as you say, represented in Britain by Tony Cliff. Castoriadis and Laforte's state capitalist analysis, I think, is slightly more, I wouldn't say cultural, that's obviously the direction their politics are going in, but it's slightly more about the kind of bureaucratic element and the management element of the Soviet Union. I think Cliff's theory has more of a basis in Marxism and the economy and capital and stuff like that. I think it's fair to say. I think the other thing that's quite interesting that yeah, absolutely, that, you know, what you say about Ken Weller and Morris Brinton is obviously Chris Pallis's pseudonym, part of the Solidarity group, as you mentioned. Castoriadis actually debated the International Socialists at a meeting, I believe, in London, and the person he debated for the International Socialists was Alistair MacIntyre, the famous Christian philosopher, Aristotelian philosopher, who apparently, according to a number of sources, just turned around and said he agreed with Castoriadis pretty much, which I imagine caused some consternation in Socialist Review Group circles. But anyway, that's some of the background. Going forth, Solidarity, the group that Brinton and Weller and others set up, basically became the publisher and translator of Castoriadis' Socialism or Barbarism, writing in English, and present interesting pamphlets, The Fate of Marxism, history as creation, things like that, which must have been some of the most interesting products of the 60s left in terms of unorthodox tracts that were sold on picket lines and protests and the like, I would imagine, at least in terms of not completely out there wacky, but, quite serious, but quite different. And again, both centre on history as creation, this idea of the imagination being the real animating element in the revolutionary movement rather than economic circumstances or something along those lines.
Another couple of ideas occur to me. One is that the whole business of Guy Debord and the Situationists, the fact that they spill out of the same milieu one way or another, at least Debord himself does with a few of the other core Situationists, that's obviously a story in and of itself. And I promise I will do a podcast on the Situationists at some point. The problem with the Situationists is that everybody loves them these days, but I will do a podcast on why they're right to do so. But I think we can bracket them for now. That's a whole tale in itself. But one thing that occurred to me when you were talking about Castoriadis as far back as Greece, talking about rational control on the one hand, without going yet into what that means, and counterposing it to workers' power, two things occur to me at the same time. One is that has a very familiar ring to it in terms of traditions within workerism of locating the focus of class struggle at the point of production where workers exercise power, as against the rational systems that are used against them to manage them and tell them when to, clock on and clock off and all of these kind of things. But of course, as soon as you start thinking in those terms, the other half of that dialectic is Lenin's obsession with time and management and with Taylorism. And once you start thinking of workers' power in those terms, you're either going to have to back off at some point, or if you're going to be even remotely consistent, you're going to have to break with Leninism and with the corresponding parts of Trotskyism. I mean, you're absolutely right to point out the different types of state capitalism that existed. So Schilliger's The Russian Enigma basically says that Russia is capitalist because the Communist Party members have leather boots and nobody else does. That's basically enough for Schilliger. The Socialism or Barbarism group's focus of their state capitalism is more to do with relations of power in industry and elsewhere. Whereas the International Socialist Cliffite thing was much more about Cliff's attempt to show, how value still enforces itself. I mean, it's quite an arcane argument and it was boring when I agreed with it. But the point is, these different groups, although there were different types of capitalism, they were often groping towards the same ends. What became the International Socialist fetishism of socialism from below overlaps with the Castoriadis and the Socialism or Barbarism groups focus on building workers' power. I want to jump ahead slightly, Joe, because I think that's given a good flavour of the milieu from which Castoriadis emerged. But what happened to Castoriadis next? I'd like you to fill us in on that and what happened to him, because he ended up breaking very significantly with Marxism in an absolutely fascinating way. So I guess before we get on to talk more specifically about the social imaginary, maybe you could tell us about this, a grey area for me in terms of my knowledge of Castoriadis, that trajectory out of socialism or barbarism, the experience of 68 and through into the 70s. What happened to Castoriadis?
Throughout the 50s, he wrote a series of texts called On the Content of Socialism, which was essentially an attempt to develop a similar project to the Council of Communists of the 20s, but without too much of the dogma, and to talk about factory councils, kind of how socialism could be organized in a democratic way in a society with mass media, with electronic communication and stuff like that to some degree, although some of that's quite latent content, I would say. What's really interesting, and I thought I'd quickly mention because it really contrasts to Lenin's Taylorism, is this idea that Castoriadis develops in the 1950s, which is that if the factory floor was managed on the basis of the instructions of management, it would fall apart almost immediately, because essentially workers have to bend the rules or break the rules in order to make the system function, because the kind of bureaucratic control essentially doesn't work in these kind of things. Actually, some of my interests nowadays is organizational theory of kind of Luhmann and various post-functionalist theorists of that kind. And that's completely in line with the most modern ideas of organizational theory, that basically you have to break the rules in order to make the organization function. I will quickly say that Castoriadis, throughout his transformations, remained a radical up until the 1980s and 1990s. He was saying that all social incomes should be equalized. As a professor at the Collège de France, that was his position, which is kind of heartening in a way that he continued having those kind of things. So briefly, Castoriadis essentially develops a theory. He becomes interested in psychoanalysis, and he develops a theory of the psyche at some point up into the 60s, where he thinks that essentially the activity of the human psyche is a kind of otherness that is spilled out into history. Now, the relationship between the individual and the social here is a little bit hazy to me. I think that's a fair enough starting point to say that human being psyche, the unconscious and stuff like that, has a certain creativity that is then spilled into history. And he sees little pockets of what he calls autonomy, or autonomous kind of thought and autonomous activity in history, which he compares to heteronomy, which is the idea that he essentially sees it as covering over human creativity by attributing it elsewhere. So it's a kind of projection scenario where you feel back in terms to some degree, put it to God or to some other kind of force that creates history. And of course, being a Marxist, you can't help but notice that the forces of production, or the relation of production, or the economy, or the increase in social production more broadly, plays this role in Marx. There's a really important idea here in a text called The Fate of Marxism. It's a breaking with the kind of postulates of the New Left in some ways, to say that a reinvigoration of Marxism isn't possible because all the theory is the sum total of the categories it uses. And if the categories it uses can't describe the modern world, therefore it's not really fit for purpose. And clearly Castoriadis is thinking of a Freudian perspective here. He was always influenced by Max Weber's cultural sociology, and he was obviously influenced by a number of other intellectual progenitors, particularly the Greek tradition, which we will possibly come on to. So I think, therefore, he kind of breaks with Marxism because he sees it as a form of national mastery, as we say. And this in itself becomes a kind of boss class ideology, which is obviously very much seen in the Eastern European regimes. I think the other thing that's really important, which Castoriadis is great admirer, the great sociologist Johan Arneson, has noted, brought out in his work, is that Marxism, as formulated by Marx, reflects a counterculture of 19th century capitalist ideology. In that period, the economy comes to be seen an autonomous factor in itself, rather than a factor of politics like it was in pre-capitalist society. And therefore, Marxism developed as a counterculture, as an oppositional ideology, but which takes on this kind of economics first productivist framework. And therefore, Kessler says this a number of times, Marxists can do a Marxist analysis of almost anything except Marxism itself. It understands capitalism as an autonomous social system that has values and logic and that, but it stops there. It's a radically constructivist theory of the economy. If it deals with any other phenomena, it must subset that within that, rather than having a radically constructivist theory of politics or of law or something like that. It always has to be folded into those categories of Marx, which is one of the reasons it breaks with it. Obviously, the other main reason is this question of the imagination, which is obviously interlinked completely anyway.
This idea of the imagination, when he introduced it, I suppose we ought to jump forward to that somewhat now, because I've been thinking about it in a kind of abstract way. So I know how Blake describes the imagination. So I was quite, even knowing something about Castoriadis' background, I was still quite surprised when I discovered that he'd written at some length, very philosophically, about imagination. And, without over-egging it, he's really leaning on this distinction between, Coleridge calls it the essenplasm, which is a word you'll know, Joe, because we used to use it in the AMM, the Association of Musical Marxists, a lot. And it's one of my favourite words. It is this kind of creation ex nihilo. And This is such a huge difference conceptually, philosophically, in every possible way to the kind of Wordsworthian notion that its implications wash right through everything that Castoriadis has to say at this point. So, for example, you talk about, he turns this around into a critique of Marxism. I don't know if you want to say where the key texts are in that regard. I've read some brilliantly clear essays by Castoriadis in critiquing Marx, where he gets down to really basic ideas. Just to take one, only because it was very important to me when I read it, for example, on this idea of Marxism claiming to describe a realm of freedom where the proletariat as the identical subject-object becomes a subject. It rises from mere objectivity to become an identical subject-object, a subject, so to say. And Castoriadis focuses in on the absurdity of a philosophical system that claims that the peak of workers' freedom is when they all join the SWP. They express their freedom by coming to realize the necessity of what they have to do next. And it's such an absurd thing when Castoriadis describes it like that. So I'm saying there's a whole area of Castoriadis where there are these really interesting Marxism. They're really worth it if you're into that kind of thing. In talking of the history of the social, the imaginary constitution of society, the way that we have created these systems for propagating particular imaginary structures, the way we've done all that is the product of imagination. And because this imagination is creation ex nihilo, it means that none of this history can be explained as the history of the rational conquest of nature or anything else. And it certainly can't be explained by Marxism. So there seems to be a huge philosophical chasm opened up between Castoriadis and Marx, quite precisely focused around this idea of the imagination. And I was genuinely surprised to start from Castoriadis, where he's talking about the history of the philosophical concept of imagination. And he basically says it's almost completely occluded. He talks about how Aristotle spoke of the foundational level of the imagination as an originary power. And I'm sure this isn't the whole picture. In fact, I've heard people say that he's overlooking a number of things here. But he basically skips right forward to Kant and says that really philosophy once again takes the imagination seriously. And then Heidegger, but his point is that that's about it. It's pretty much occluded. And the reason he says occluded, and this all struck me as really significant from a Blakean point of view, where Blake's great enemy is Eurism, the reasoning power in man. And what Blake says about the imagination is that it's occluded because the reasoning power in man cannot admit that it is determined by something outside of itself, the undetermined, the imagination. So if you like, it's the rational power of man that's occluding the imagination because it would be Eurism admitting his weakness. I guess my question is, do you have anything to say about this sort of philosophical aspect of Castoriadis' approach to the imagination, perhaps where it connects with psychoanalysis? Because, again, that's something I don't really know anything about.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, just to return to the point on Marx, which I think is quite useful for this, is a very important essay called The Question of the Workers' Movement, or The Question of the History of the Workers' Movement. I think it is. It's in the Social and Political Writings, Volume 3 of Castoriadis, where he is talking about philosophy and about the primacy of the economic in Marx and the sovereignty of what he calls the theoretico-speculative. He quotes Marx saying, it is not a question of what is this or that proletariat or even the whole proletariat. It's a question of what the proletariat is, and in accordance with this being, what would be historically compelled to do. And it critiques Marx here saying, where is this proletariat and how is it different to all previous philosophers? And it's like, it's in Marx's head, this proletariat that is historically compelled to do something for some external purpose. And obviously, I think that really gets to the grip of Castoriadis' later politics, because he ceases to believe in a kind of movement of history or anything like that. I mean, barely did in the first place from the 50s, I think, probably, but and starts to see these moments coming out, whether it will be the notion of the ancient polis is important to Castoriadis, the notion of the guilds and the Italian city-states are important, and then obviously the questions of the workers' movement in the 19th century especially. He contrasts the idea of the kind of social republic of 19th century pre-Marxist workers' movement to the idea of, a movement towards communism that's far more deterministic and based upon a kind of rationally explicable program rather than something more organic, but clearly something more spontaneous, as it were. So I think that's important. As regards the idea of, I'm much more at home in the psychoanalysis than I am in the philosophy, but I think you can say something here, which is that Castoriadis is very important, Freud's idea of primary narcissism, which is this idea that the child in the early years, the early months of its life, doesn't see a difference between itself and the outside world, doesn't understand a distinction between the mother and itself, and essentially has something of an omnipotence of thought. Basically, the psyche creates forms and basically it is a site of free creation. And obviously after the child is socialized and the Oedipal situation happens where it's forced into society, that something remains of that state. And it's a kind of halcyon state that in subterranean, unconscious ways, the mind of the human individual is always trying to get back to. And this kind of relates to the idea of symmetry and perfection and the idea of utopia. And when you obviously read the early utopian writings, it's all about rows of symmetrical houses, and there's lots of numerology in there about things that add up to big holes and stuff like that. And I think that's important because Castoriadis once said that humans are fundamentally unfit for life, that the imaginative powers make them unhappy, make them not functional, not instrumentally rational like animals are apparently in Castoriadis' view. And that kind of breaks him from the part of the New Left that basically he wanted to say that the late Marx was essentially either an invention of collaborators or a kind of misstep, and go back to the 1844 manuscripts, because Castoriadis says this idea of species being an unalienated labour is a mythology. We've always been problematic. He understands creation not as a positive force per se. I think in one of his later lectures on psychoanalysis that was really beautiful, actually, he says something along the lines of, when a man or a group of men first captured another man and chained him to a pole and got him to work for him, that is as much a work of the imagination as a beautiful temple or as a theory of creation or something like that. And I think that's really important because this imagination is part of the condition of the evolutionary in a completely non-determinist form. It always could have been something else, but it's something that human beings have developed. And this ability to create things ex nihilo, out of nothing, is one of the most motivating forces in history, is probably the motivating force in human history, certainly for Castoriadis. And that's why human history is, to quote Max Weber, he called it something along the lines of a street paved with broken stones by the devil or something like that. I think that's important. That's the kind of starting point of this theory as far as I see it.
That's fascinating, Joe. It was great to talk to people about these things, even if you've thought about them by yourself for a long, long time. Just hearing other people talk and talking yourself illuminates so much for me. And I think you've opened up a whole area there. What you were saying about his critique of Marx, you said at some point he was basing it on this idea that there's something fundamental about the human experience that's problematic, something low level. It made me think a couple of things. One is that precisely the radicalism in his view of the imagination as being undetermined is bound to cut the foundations from under Marx. Once you take that view seriously, because it pulls away all the foundations of everything outside of man in nature and all sorts of things. So it's going to be problematic for Marx. But what it also made me think of is that when Castoriadis talks about these things, he flips easily between talking about this kind of visionary, foundational, collective, social imaginary, which is our power to create society ex nihilo. And then he quickly flips between that and the individual experience of the imagination. And that's where a lot of politics takes place, if you know what I mean, in the experience of thinking about your own relation to things and so on. And what I'm trying to say is that he's painting he's got this really radical idea of the imagination, but it doesn't leave the individual radically free. And I mean that in a couple of ways. One is, yes, the collective imagination is entirely free to create ex nihilo new social relations. But of course, everything about our upbringing and the whole of the history of, what psychoanalysis is about is the story of the ways that we're socialized. And of course, he's very aware of how we are socialized into this pre-existing social imaginary. And what you were saying about primary narcissism and so on reminded me of something I noted Castoriadis talking about. And I assume it was a dig at Lacan, but in any case, he talks about mimesis, mirroring people do. And I think he's talking about the Lacanian idea of a mirror phase. And he asserts that actually this primary imagination constructs all of that as well, the mechanisms through which socialization takes place. At the bottom of it all is the imagination. And that's such a radical position. But I wanted to ask you another question, Joe, which is this. We've talked about Castoriadis' politics generally, his break from Trotskyism, his move towards workers' power, and ultimately with this emphasis on the imagination. And he expresses that philosophically in his writings about Aristotle, Kant, Heidegger, and so on. But there's also this domain that he started with, the domain of the directly political, and what all of this means for the political. And he says a couple of things. His basic insight, I'm quoting here, he says, because the instituting social imaginary from the start of history, one sees the emergence of radical novelty. There is in human collectivity a via formandi, which I call the instituting social imaginary. But then he quickly moves on to say, on societies in which the possibility and the ability to call established institutions and significations into question are exceptional. And he offers two examples, which is ancient Greece and, as he puts it, Western Europe after the Middle Ages. And these are exceptional situations. And I suppose what I'm saying is this, Joe. He's described the imagination philosophically as a realm of complete freedom. He's applied it in general to society to say that the certain principle of social imaginary has complete freedom, but we nevertheless end up with this picture of individuals that are completely trapped within an existing social imaginary. And not only that, but there are even caveats about in what kind of society is it even possible to push the radical social imaginary towards autonomy and things like that. So that's what I wanted to ask you about, is the political, I don't mean political with a capital P, in the wider sense, the political application of this notion of the imaginary in projects and communities and so on. What does it mean?
I think we can start with Lacan and move through this question, because one of Castoriadis' critiques of Lacan and Lacan's imaginary is that he says it's purely spectral, it's purely about the images. And Castoriadis moves away from this with this idea that it's actually about signification. And obviously signification just means meaning. So whether that's God, whether that's the general secretary of the party, whether that's nature, they're all social imaginary significations, as is commodity, economy, growth and all that kind of stuff. The instituting social imaginary is obviously a kind of second order term that Castoriadis gives a phenomenon that he identifies in history. And I think in his mind, that is active, but the distinction between what we would say with societies where there's a possibility of autonomy and what he would call autonomous societies, i.e. all of these societies apart from the two you've mentioned, is that radically creative impulse, for want of a better word, is covered over by its attribution to extra social sources. Whereas in his view in ancient Greece, although he kind of disparages the Greek religion and says it's not really a main thing, and what's mainly going on is the idea that the polis, despite slavery, despite all this stuff, is about people coming up with their own laws. And autonomy in its most literal form means the giving of laws from outside. So, and autonomy means self-giving laws. So I think he sees in those two historical examples where that starts to break down and people start to say, actually, we can create our own laws and create our own society on the basis of what we think. And Castoriadis, going back to the idea of the primary narcissism, he even says a scientist uses this in his development of a theory and stuff like that. And, there's a number of interesting articles he wrote on science where he talked to truth being a very important social thing, but also being a constructed thing. It's something that we agree on. It's something social. It's about the values and the significations that society hold dear. So I think that for him is the political project. There's some elements of his work where he's talking about the idea of chaos, the idea of nothingness, and that has to be accepted. He takes it back to ancient Greece. I don't know the pre-Socratics, etc. enough to really comment here. But the idea that outside of the social world, it is a void, it is a chaos of which we use our imagination to construct a world in a certain sense. And for him, I think the project of autonomy, which he sees as a society that understands that it's its own creation and can work on that basis, on the basis of collective decision making and radical citizen democracy, needs to be based in this idea that's kind of in Heidegger in a very different way of the kind of being towards death. The fact that we know we're not going to be around here forever. Nevertheless, we're going to create social institutions on the basis of this kind of plane of existence where the meaninglessness is ever present and death is a heartbeat away, as it were. I don't know that answers your question, but this idea of social imaginary significations, this idea of meaning, for want of a better term, that sociologists would probably call meaning, in other words, and the way that it's transmitted through history is very important. So I think, clearly the imaginative capacities in heteronomous societies, he calls them, they're covered over. And the kind of radical difference or possibility of difference in societies where that is questioned, that rarity is a part of it. And clearly he develops a politics, to speak of politics with a big P for a second, talking about the movements of the 60s, talking about what nowadays we would call anti-oppression politics, and also talking about green politics. And green politics is very important to Castoriadis because he sees this rational mastery as about turning nature into resources in a way that prefigures work with people like Val Plumwood, the idea that nature is seen as feminine and kind of soft, and reason and mastery is seen as masculine and active, is there as well. We probably should say that this idea of ancient Greece and modern Europe being the main arenas of this idea is probably a bit problematic in the sense of some of the more knowledge we have about non-Western societies now, but we don't need to get into that. But nevertheless, he moved towards that. It's a very high bar, I think, his later politics. But he does say in a way that's quite important for today, actually, of seeing, the limited democracy that we have in kind of parliamentary systems, what he calls liberal societies rather than democratic societies, is something important to be saved. It has trade union rights, has a legal order that isn't purely based on force and power and stuff like that. And that obviously tracks quite importantly with the rise of populism and the rise of authoritarian and as we would say, heteronomous values that are meant to speak for all of society and meant to be given by, I guess it's in the modern social imaginary provided by that is something like reason or rationality, whether it's of Dawkins or of Viktor Orban, is a question of degree rather than difference in some ways.
Yeah, I was trying to flip between these different mindsets, and one of them is the kind of Castoriadis, libertarian, Marxist, and the other's Blake. And all the talk about the growth of the rationalization of the production and things like that. Such an obvious analogue of what Blake talked about as being Newton's wheels turning, the great Eurozenic wheels of reason turning that turn forever, and basically a great hall of mirrors. And I guess from a Blakean point of view, what they lack is what Castoriadis saw in the production process, is that in reality it's not all wheels rotating effortlessly, turning each other forever. There are people there actually, as you said, mapping that system onto the world to make it work. Given what's going on in the world today, the lens through which I increasingly look at all politics is whether a particular political approach can distinguish. I've defriended a number of people this week online just because of what's happening in America. I'm defriending anybody who says there's nothing to choose between the Republicans and the Democrats right now, because if you can't tell the difference between the two things, your politics suck. So I was quite pleased with what you were saying earlier with reference to Castoriadis and his awareness of where that line is drawn. But there's a couple of other things that I noticed in what you were saying that particularly attracted me. One is Castoriadis' thing about the point of the exercise of this imagination is to create symbolic systems which create a different kind of seamless experience. They try and banish this chaos. And the reason that struck a note with me is because I just finished writing a long piece about the Book of Job. And it was reading the Book of Job and Blake's reaction to it that convinced me of the chaos underlying society. I think it ends up, that in the Book of Job, might be too much detail here, but the Book of Job, Yahweh says that he created Leviathan and the behemoth, whereas in all the equivalent myths of the region, telling the same story. It's the Leviathan and the Behemoth that are God's enemies at the dawn of creation, and Yahweh creates the world by subordinating their chaos to his rule. But in the book of Job, he says he created that chaos as well. Part of me thinks that Blake absorbed a bit of that in his sense of system. I had one last question for you, Joe, and we can finish on this because we talked for quite a while. And it's a bit of I just thought I'd finish on a bit of a diversion. I find so much in Castoriadis rich and suggestive. I was flicking through some of his stuff in preparation for this meeting, and I just saw this whole bit that he wrote about the interregnum, where he's talking about this idea that in a kind of long-term sense, capitalism is running out of ideas. In other words, the imaginative power of capitalism, vampire-like, attached itself to and sucked dry. In some sense, that process is running out. And it's as straightforward as saying, he thinks painting is getting boring. He did when he wrote this essay. And I just wondered, my appreciation of Castoriadis doesn't hinge on this, but I wondered what you thought about it. It's kind of sense of a long-term decline of capitalism. It's increasing inability to harness what he ultimately saw as the motor power of society, the imagination.
Yeah, I mean, there is a part of Lake Castoriadis where he talks about art in this way of essentially being repetitive, just reutilising forms, not creating ex nihilo, I suppose, is that apparently was quite friendly with Ornette Coleman. And in one of his essays, he says something along the lines of, after Coleman and Miles Davis, jazz just started to repeat itself. I don't listen to a lot of music that's produced nowadays, some, but not, that's not my go-to. So, I'm in my 40s, so I guess that could say something. But I do feel it's just kind of an old man's gripes in some ways from Castoriadis. I can't help but feel that. Clearly, he writes things in later days about how capitalism has become a huge casino, and it's got no relation to, these are quite familiar concerns that you hear a lot. I think the jury's out. He died in 1997, and I think we can probably all agree that, with the exception of maybe hip-hop and a few other associated art forms, the 90s was a bit of a cultural desert. Has it got better since? I don't know. Clearly, we've now got to a society, where there's been quite a creative explosion in terms of electronic communication, in terms of social media, in terms of the internet and all that kind of stuff. Clearly, there are a lot of negative effects from that. I think it's too early to say, probably, but I'm not sure how closely I would relate that to capitalism, despite being an anti-capitalist. I think that's maybe a residue of an old system of thought that Castoriadis mostly had left behind. I don't see our society as a capitalist society per se. I see it as an element of our society rather than that. So I don't know if that answers your question.
It was a trick question because I asked you about the interregnum stuff, saying it was a complete side issue. But of course, I found it attractive because as an old man, I tend to agree with it. But painting's been rubbish. It's abstract expressionism. Obviously, I'm half joking, but obviously, I'm not joking. I just like that grumpiness in what he was saying. But I think that's the job of all people who hate the society they live in. Everything seems to have got worse and worse, whatever. But more generally, thanks very much for joining me today, Joe. I feel as though I got there are a few things that cropped up. A few times I got some really good insight into Castoriadis. I'm convinced that he's directly relevant to what I'm trying to do in patch Blake's Christian ethics and politics with some kind of more thought-through version of how you apply the imagination to radical politics. So Thanks very much for talking to me about it. I really will be following this up. As you know, I've talked also to Jules Alford, who I know you looked into some of this stuff like Castoriadis with Jules, and I hope to get him on to talk about Castoriadis as well. So what I'm trying to say is this is very much an open topic with me. I think there's a lot of interesting things to be found out about and in mapping of those different kind of areas from Blake and Castoriadis. But in any case, thanks again, Joe. It's great to talk to you. And you did mention to me in one of the little breaks we had along the way of doing this recording that I said that you were doing your research in Romania when it's Albania. But it's not obvious, but it was Albania. So I'm going to mention that now so that I don't have to go back and do a fancy edit. Got myself looking stupid, all right? It was Albania. Maybe we'll talk about that in the future. But Once again, thanks very much, Joe. And thanks to everyone out there who's listening. I would encourage you to, because this podcast is syndicated these days and it goes out from Substack to Apple and to Amazon and to all kinds of things. But if you do get to hear this, do come and visit travellerintheevening.com, which is my Substack. And the reason for doing that is you can subscribe and then you get to find out about all kinds of other things that we're up to. But in this case, I wanted to mention that I've transcribed loads of notes I had, not about Castoriadis, but notes I'd taken from his books. I transferred them all and I put a piece up on the Traveller in the evening for anyone who's interested. So that's another reason to follow through and take out a subscription, because you'll find lots of transcribed notes on Castoriadis if you do that. So thanks again, Joe. Thanks everyone for listening, and I'll speak to you all the next time there is a Traveller in the Evening podcast. Thanks, everybody.